All right, welcome back to Tragedy and Hope Live. I guess they released the entire Epstein files today, no redactions or anything like that, which just makes the fact that no one's gonna get arrested from it that much more kind of in your face. All right, still on The Future in Perspective, page 1247. Like the second paragraph down. In American politics, we have several parties included under the blanket words Democratic and Republican. In oversimplified terms, as I have said, the Republicans were the party of the middle classes, and the Democrats were the party of the fringes. Both of these were subdivided, each with a congressional and a national party wing. The Republican Congressional Party, representing localism, was much farther to the right than the National Republican Party, and as such was closer to the petty bourgeois than to the upper middle class outlook. The Democratic Congressional Party was much more clearly of the fringes and minorities, and thus often further to the left than the Democratic National Party. The party machinery in each case was in congressional party control during the intervals between the quadrennial presidential election, but in order to win these elections, each had to call into existence, in presidential election years, its shadowy national party. This meant that the Republicans had to appear to move to the left, closer to the center, while the Democrats also had to move from the fringes towards the center, usually by moving to the right. As a result, the national parties and their presidential candidates, with the Eastern establishment assiduously fostering the process behind the scenes, moved closer together and met nearly in the center with almost identical candidates and platforms, although the process was concealed as much as possible by the revival of obsolescent or meaningless war cries and slogans, often going back to the Civil War. So basically, what they're saying is, in order to get the actual right-wing people to vote for their centrist uniparty candidate, they will just say whatever you want to hear. As soon as the presidential election was over, the two national parties vanished and party controls fell back into the hands of the congressional parties, leaving the newly elected president in a precarious position between the two congressional parties, neither of which was very close to the brief national coalition that had elected him. The chief problem of American political life for a long time has been how to make the two congressional parties more national and international. The argument that the two parties should represent opposed ideals and policies, one perhaps of the right and the other of the left, is a foolish idea acceptable only to doctrinaire and academic thinkers. Instead, the two parties should be almost identical so that the American people can throw the rascals out at any election without leading to any profound or extensive shifts in policy. To the Coke or Pepsi politics. The policies that are vital and necessary for America are no longer subjects of significant disagreement, but are disputable only in details of procedure, priority, or method. We must remain strong, continue to function as a great world power in cooperation with other powers, avoid high-level war, keep the economy moving without a significant slump, help other countries do the same, provide the basic social necessities for all our citizens, open up opportunities for social shifts for those willing to work to achieve them, and defend the basic Western outlook of diversity, pluralism, cooperation, and the rest of it, as already described. These things any national American party hoping to win a presidential election must accept. But either party in office becomes in time corrupt, tired, unenterprising, and vigorless. Then it should be possible to replace it every 4 years if necessary by the other party, which will be none of these things, but will still pursue with new vigor approximately the same basic policies. The capture of the Republican National Party by the extremist elements of the Republican Congressional Party in 1964 and their effort to elect Barry Goldwater to the presidency with the petty bourgeois extremist alone was only a temporary aberration on the American political scene and arose from the fact that President Johnson had preempted all the issues which are, as we have said, now acceptable to the overwhelming majority, and had occupied the whole broad center of the American political spectrum, so that it was hardly worthwhile for the Republicans to run a real contestant against him in the same area. Thus, Goldwater was able to take control of the Republican National Party by default. The virulence behind Goldwater's campaign, however, had nothing to do with default or lack of intensity. Quite the contrary. His most ardent supporters were of the extremist petty bourgeois mentality, driven to near hysteria by the disintegration of the middle classes and the steady rise in prominence of everything they considered anathema: Catholics, Negroes, immigrants, intellectuals, aristocrats, and near aristocrats, scientists, and educated men generally, people from big cities or from the East, cosmopolitans and internationalists, and above all, liberals who accept diversity as a virtue. This disintegration of the middle classes had a variety of causes, some of them intrinsic, many of them accidental, a few of them obvious, but many of them going deeply into the very depths of social existence. All these causes acted to destroy the middle classes by acting to destroy the middle class outlook, and this outlook was destroyed not by adult middle class persons abandoning it, but by a failure or inability of parents to pass it to their children. Moreover, this failure was largely restricted to the middle class itself and not to the petty bourgeois, lower middle class, which, if anything, was clinging to its particular version of the middle class outlook more tenaciously and was passing it on to its offspring in an even more intensified form. What I am saying here is that the disintegration of the middle class arose from a failure to transfer its outlook to its children. I can come up with a few reasons why that happened. This failure was thus a failure of education and may seem at first glance to be all the more surprising since our education system has been, consciously or unconsciously, organized as a mechanism for indoctrination of the young in middle class ideology, but now it's into Marxist communist ideology. In fact, rather surprisingly, it would appear that our educational system, unlike those of continental Europe, has been more concerned with indoctrination of middle class outlook than with teaching patriotism or nationalism. As a reflection of this, it has been more concerned with installing attitudes and behaviors than with intellectual training. Again, what was I saying before? That school is there to condition you into society. It's not to teach you. That's why you should homeschool your kids if possible. I know everybody can't do that, but if it's possible, you should definitely try to homeschool your kids. In view of the fact that the American ideals of the 1920s, as much middle class as patriotic, with the so called American way of life, identified rather with the American economic and social system than with the American political system, and the fact that a majority of school children were not from middle class families, it is not surprising that the educational system was devoted to training in the middle class outlook. Children of racial, religious, national, and class minorities all passed through the same system and received the middle class formative process. With it must be recognized, incomplete success in many cases. This refers to the public schools, but the Roman Catholic school system, especially on its upper levels, was doing the same thing. The large number of Catholic men's colleges in the country, especially those operated by the Jesuits, had as their basic, if often unrecognized aim, the desire to transform the sons of the working class and often of immigrant origins into middle class people in professional occupations, chiefly law, medicine, business, and teaching. On the whole, this system was, until recently, a success, but is now becoming less and less successful in turning out middle class people, especially from its upper educational levels. This failure can be attributed rather to the context within which the educational system has operated than to a failure of the system itself. As we shall see in a moment, this failure occurred chiefly within the middle class family, a not unexpected situation, since the outlook is still determined rather by reaction to family conditions than by submission to formal educational process. Much of the disintegration of the middle class outlook can be traced to a weakening of its chief aspects, such as future preference, intense self discipline, and, to a lesser degree, to a decreasing emphasis on infinitely expandable material demand and on the importance of middle class status symbols. Yo, these people act like these boomers were like saving so much money when in fact they were just printing money for themselves and giving it to themselves. Like they act like the boomers were like genius savers or something. It's like, no, the money was actually increasing in value during that time period. Only a few of the factors that have influenced these changes can be mentioned here. The chief external factor in the destruction of the middle class outlook was the fact that you can't buy a house anymore, has been the relentless attack upon it in literature and drama through most of the 20th century. In fact, it is difficult to find works that defend this outlook or even assumed it to be true, as was frequent in the 19th century. Not that such works did not exist in recent years, they have existed in great numbers and have been avidly welcomed by the petty bourgeois and by some middle class housewives. Lending libraries and women's magazines of the 1910s, 1920s, and 1930s were full of them, but by the 1950s, they were largely restricted to television soap dramas. Even those writers who explicitly accepted the middle class ideology, like Booth Tarkington, Ben Ames Wilson, Sloan Wilson, or John O'Hara, tended to portray middle class life as a horror of false values, hypocrisy, meaningless effort, and insecurity, kind of like Married with Children. In Alice Adams, for example, Tarkington portrayed a lower middle class girl filled with hypocrisy and materialistic values, desperately seeking a husband who would provide her with the higher social status for which she yearned, hypergamy. In the earlier period, even down to 1940s, literature's attack on the middle class outlook was direct and brutal, from such works as Upton Sinclair's The Jungle or Frank Norris's The Pit, both dealing with the total corruption of personal integrity in the meatpacking and wheat markets. These early assaults were aimed at the commercialization of life under bourgeois influence and were fundamentally reformist in outlook because they assumed that the evils of the system could somehow be removed, perhaps by state intervention. By the 1920s, the attack was much more total and saw the problem in moral terms so fundamental that no remedial action was possible. Only complete rejection of middle class values could remove the corruption of human life seen by Sinclair, Lewis, and Babbitt or Main Street. After 1940, writers tended less and less to attack the bourgeois way of life. That job had been done. Instead, they described situations, characters, and actions that were simply non bourgeois. violence, social irresponsibility, sexual laxity and perversion, miscegenation, human weakness in relation to alcohol, narcotics, or sex, or domestic and business relationships conducted along completely non bourgeois lines. Ernest Hemingway, William Faulkner, Erskine Caldwell, John Dos Passos, and a host of lesser writers, many of them embracing the cult of violence, showed the trend. A very popular work like The Lost Weekend could represent the whole group. A few, like Hemingway, found a new moral outlook to replace the middle class ideology they had abandoned. In Hemingway's case, he shook the dust of upper middle class Oak Park, Illinois, off his feet and immersed himself in the tragic sense of life of Spain, with its constant demand upon men to demonstrate their virility by incidental activity with women and unflinching courage in facing death. To Hemingway, this could be achieved in the bull ring, in African big game hunting, in war, or in a more symbolic way, in prize fighting or crime. The significant point here is that Hemingway's embrace of the outlook of the Pakistani Peruvian axis as a token of his rejection of the middle class background was always recognized by him as a pretense, and when his virility, in the crudest sense, was gone, he blew out his brains. The literary assault on the bourgeois outlook was directed at all the aspects of it that we have mentioned, at future preference, at self-discipline, at the emphasis on not on materialistic acquisition, at status symbols. The attack on future preference appeared as a demonstration that the future is never reached. Its argument was that the individual who constantly postpones living from the present, with living taken to mean real personal relationships with individuals, to a hypothetical future eventually finds that the years have gone by, death is approaching, he has not yet lived, and is in most cases no longer able to do so. Yeah, it's like waiting till you're 80 to retire so that you can finally spend your money, but then you're too old to do anything. If the central figure in such a work has achieved his materialist ambitions, the implication is that these achievements, which look so attractive from a distance, are but encumbrances to the real values of personal living when achieved. This theme, which goes back at least to Charles Dickens' A Christmas Carol or to George Eliot's Silas Marner, continued to be present into the 20th century. It often took the form, in more recent times, of a rejection of a man's whole life achievements by his sons, his wife, or himself. The more recent form of this attack on future preference has appeared in the existentialist novel and the theater of the absurd. Existentialism, by its belief that reality and life consist only of the specific, concrete personal experiences of a given place and moment, ignores the context of each event and thus isolates it. But an event without context has no cause, meaning, or consequence. It is absurd, as anything is which has no relationship to any context. And such an event, with neither past nor future, can have no connection with tradition or with future preference. This point of view came to saturate 20th century literature so that the original rejection of future preference was expanded into a total rejection of time, which was portrayed as simply a mechanism for enslaving man and depriving him of the opportunity to experience life. The writings of Thomas Wolfe and, on a higher level, of the early Dos Passos were devoted to this theme. The bourgeois time clock became a tomb or prison that alienated man from life and left him a cipher, like the appropriately named Mr. Zero in Elmer Rice's play The Adding Machine, 1923. A similar attack was made on self discipline. The philosophic basis for this attack was found in an oversimplified Freudianism that regarded all suppression of human impulse as leading to frustration and psychic distortions that made subsequent life unattainable. Thus, novel after novel or play after play portrayed the wickedness of the suppression of good, healthy, natural impulse and the salutary consequence of self indulgence, especially in sex, adultery, and other manifestations of undisciplined sexuality were described in increasingly clinical detail and were generally associated with excessive drinking or other evasions of personal responsibility, as in Hemingway's A Farewell to Arms and The Sun Also Rises, or in John Steinbeck's love affair with personal irresponsibility in Canary Row or Tortilla Flat. The total rejection of middle class values, including time, self discipline, and material achievement, in favor of a cult of personal violence, was to be found in a multitude of literary works, from James M. Cain and Raymond Chandler to the more recent antics of James Bond. The result has been a total reversal of middle class values by presenting as interesting or admirable simple negation of these values by aimless, shiftless, and totally irresponsible people. Seems like hip hop is like the culmination of that, like commercialized rap, gangster rap. A similar reversal of values has flooded the market with novels filled with pointless clinical descriptions presented in obscene language and in fictional forms of swamps of perversion ranging from homosexuality, incest, sadism, and masochism to cannibalism, necrophilia, and corophagia. Never even heard corporophagia. Don't even know what that is. These performances, as the critic Edmund Fuller had said, represent not so much the loss of values as a loss of any conception of the nature of man. Wow, that puts a whole new light on all the Epstein stuff. Instead of seeing man the way the tradition of the Greeks and of the West regarded him, as a creature midway between animal and God, a little lower than the angels, and thus capable of an infinite variety of experiences, these 20th century writers have completed the revolt against the middle classes by moving downward from the late 19th century's view of man as simply a higher animal to their own view of man as lower than any animal would naturally descend. From this has emerged the Puritan view of man, but without the Puritan view of God, as a creature of total depravity in a deterministic universe without hope of any redemption. The new atheist. This point of view, which in the period 1550 to 1650 justified despotism in a Puritan context, now may be used with petty bourgeois support to justify a new despotism to preserve by force instead of conviction petty bourgeois values in a system of compulsory conformity. George Orwell's 1984 has given us the picture of this system as Hitler's Germany showed us its practical operation. But in view of the present upsurge of non-bourgeois social groups and social pressures, this possibility becomes decreasingly likely, and Barry Goldwater's defeat in the presidential election of 1964 moved the possibility so far into the future that the steady change in social conditions makes it remote indeed. Well, yeah, that's if you think it's only going to come from the right. If you think that 1984 can only come from the right wing, then you're probably like, yeah, I guess beating Barry Goldwater stopped in 1984. No. The destruction of middle classes by the destruction of the middle class outlook was brought about to a much greater degree by internal than external forces, and the most significant of these influences has been operating within the middle class family. One of the most obvious of these has been the growing affluence of American society, which removed the pressure of want from the childbearing process. The child who grows up in affluence is more difficult to instill with the frustrations and drives that were so basic in the middle class outlook. For generations, even in fairly rich families, this indoctrination had continued because of continued emphasis on thrift and restraints on consumption. By 1937, the World Depression showed that the basic economic problems were not saving and investment, but distribution and consumption. Thus, there appeared a growing readiness to consume, spurred on by new sales techniques, installments selling, and the extension of credit from the productive side to the consumption side of the economic process. As a result, an entirely new phenomenon appeared in middle class families: the practice of living up to, or even beyond, their incomes, an unthinkable scandal in any 19th century bourgeois family. So basically, they switched the credit from the producers to the consumers, and then they basically trained everybody through the media that was a good thing. One incentive in this direction was the increased emphasis within the middle class ideology upon the elements of status and ostentatious displays of wealth as status symbols rather than on the elements of frugality and prudence. Thus, affluence weakened both future preference by denying self discipline training. Somewhat related to this was the influence of the Depression of 1929 to 1933. The generation that was entering manhood at that time, having been born in the period 1905 to 1915, felt that their efforts to fulfill their middle class ambitions had involved them in intensive hardships and suffering, such as working while going to college, doing without leisure, cultural expansion, and travel, and by the 1950s, these were determined that their children must never have it as hard as they had it. They rarely saw that their efforts to make things easy for their children in the 1950s as a reaction against the hardships they had suffered themselves in the 1930s were removing from their children's training process the difficulties that had helped them to make them achieving men and successful middle class persons, and that their efforts to do this were weakening the moral fiber of their children. Another element in this process was a change in the educational philosophy of America and a somewhat similar change in the country's ideas on the whole process of child training. Early generations had continued to cling to the vestiges of the Puritan outlook to the degree that they insisted that children must be trained under strict discipline, including corporal punishment. This 17th century idea, by 1920, was being replaced in the American family ideology by an idea of the 19th century that child maturation is an innate process not subject to modification by outside training. What? In educational theory, this erroneous idea went back to the Emile of Jean Jacques Rousseau, 1762, which idealized the state of nature as equivalent to the Garden of Eden and believed that education must consist in leaving a youth completely free so that his innate goodness could emerge and reveal itself. This idea was developed, intensified, and given a pseudo scientific foundation by advances in biology and genetics in the late 19th century. Well, yeah, I mean, people do have instincts. They do have instincts. By 1910 or so, child rearing and educational theories had accepted the idea that man was a biological organism like any animal, that his personality was a consequence of hereditary traits, and that each child had within him a rigid assortment of inherited talents and a natural rate of maturation in the development of these talents. These ideas were incorporated in a series of slogans, of which two were, "Every child is different," and "He'll do it when he's ready." From all this came a wholesale ending of discipline, both in the home and in school, and the advent of permissive education with all that it entailed. Children were encouraged to have opinions and to speak out on matters of which they were totally ignorant. Acquisition of information and intellectual training were shoved into the background, and restrictions of time, place, and movement in schools and homes were reduced to a minimum. Every emphasis was placed on spontaneity, and fixed schedules of time period or subject matter to be covered were belittled. All this greatly weakened the disciplinary influence of educational process, leaving the new generation much less disciplined, less organized, and less aware of time than their parents. Naturally, this disintegrative process was less evident among the children of the petty bourgeois than in the middle class itself. These influences in themselves would have contributed much to the weakening of the middle class outlook among the rising generation, but other, much more profound influences were also operating. To examine these, we must look inside the middle class family structure. In marriage, as in so many other things, Western civilization has been subjected to quite antithetical theories. These we might call the Western and Romantic theories of love and marriage. The Romantic theory of these things was that each man or woman had a unique personality consisting of inborn traits accumulated by inheritance from a unique combination of ancestors. This is, of course, the same theory that was used to justify permissive education. In romantic love, however, the theory went on to assume, simply as a matter of faith, that for each man or woman there existed in a world a person of the opposite sex whose personality traits would just fit into those of his or her destined mate. The only problem was to find that mate. It was assumed that this would be done at first sight, when an almost instantaneous flash of recognition would reveal to both that they had found the one possible life's partner. The idea of love at first sight as a flash of recognition was closely related to the Manichaean and Puritan religious idea that God's truth came to men in a similar flash of illumination, an idea that goes back, like so many of these ideas, to Plato's theory of knowledge as reminiscence. In its most extreme form, this romantic theory of love assumed that each of the destined lovers was only part of a person, the two parts fitting together instantly on meeting into a single personality. Associated with this were a number of other ideas, including the idea that marriages were made in heaven, that such a romantic marriage was totally satisfying to the partners, and that such a marriage could be eternal. These ideas of romantic love and marriage were much more acceptable to women than to men, for reasons we have not time to analyze, and were embraced by the middle class, but not to any great extent by other classes. The theory, like so much of the middle class outlook, originated among the medieval heresies such as Manichaeanism, as the Swiss writer Denis de Rougemont has shown, and was thus from the same tradition that saw the rise of the bourgeois outlook in the Middle Ages and its reinforcement by the closely associated Puritan movement of modern times. The romantic theory of love was spread through the middle class by incidental factors such as that the bourgeois were the only social class that read much, and romantic love was basically a literary convention in its propagation, whatever it may have been in its origins. It made no real impression on the other social classes in European society, such as the peasants, the nobility, or the urban working craftsmen. Strangely enough, romantic love, accepted as a theory and ideal by the bourgeois, had little influence on middle class marriages in practice, since these were usually based on middle class values of economic security and material status rather than on love. More accurately, middle class marriages were based on these material considerations, in fact, while everyone concerned pretended that they were based on romantic love. Put a post-it note on that, because that's exactly what MGTOW's been saying the whole time. That's literally what we've been saying. She doesn't actually love you. She's just there for your money. They're like, no, she loves me. She really loves me. And then why do you, when you lose your job, does she divorce you? More accurately, middle-class marriages were based on these material considerations. In fact, while everyone concerned pretended that they were based on romantic love. Notice he said pretended. And then we're like, look, the women are pretending to love you, and you guys hate women. No, shut up. This is in a 1960s, like, geopolitical book. It has nothing to do with MGTOW, and even this guy's saying the exact same thing that we're saying. Any subsequent recognition of this clash between the fact and theory often gave a severe jolt and has sometimes been a subject for literary examination, as in the first volume of John Galsworthy's The Forsyth Saga. Opposed to this romantic theory of love and marriage, and almost equally opposed to the bourgeois practice of sensible marriage, was what we may call the Western idea of love and marriage. This assumes that personalities are dynamic and flexible things formed largely by experience in the past. Love and marriage between such personalities are, like everything in the Western outlook, diverse, imperfect, adjustable, creative, cooperative, and changeable. The Western idea assumes that a couple come together for many reasons: sex, loneliness, common interest, similar background, economic and social cooperation, reciprocal admiration of character traits, and other reasons. It further assumes that their whole relationship will be a slow process of getting to know each other and of mutual adjustment, a process that never ends. The need for constant adjustment shows the Western recognition that nothing, even love, is final or perfect. This is also shown by the recognition that love and marriage are never total and all absorbing, that each partner remains an independent personality with the right to an independent life. This is found throughout the Western tradition and goes back to the Christian belief that each person is a separate soul with its own ultimately separate fate. Yeah, you can thank the Catholics for ending arranged marriages. That's a fact. Thus, there appeared in Western society at least three kinds of marriage, which we may call romantic, bourgeois, and Western. The last, without being much discussed, except in modern books on love and marriage, is probably the most numerous of the three, and the other two, if they prove successful, do so by gradually developing into this third kind. Romantic marriage, based on the shock of recognition, has in fact come to be based very largely on sexual attraction, since this is the chief form that love at first sight can take. Such marriages often fail since even sex requires practice and mutual adjustment and is too momentary a human relationship to sustain a permanent union unless many other common interests accumulate around it. Even when this occurs, the marriage becomes a success in the sense that it persists, it is never total, and the romantic delusion that marriage should be totally absorbing of the time, attention, and energies of its partners, still expected by many women brought up on the romantic idea, merely means that the marriage becomes an enslaving relationship to the husbands and a source of disappointment and frustration to the wives. This whole chapter is just like blowing Mig. Nobody told me that this guy was a MGTOW. If I had known that Carol Quigley was a MGTOW, I would have read this a lot earlier. I mean, if this doesn't describe MGTOW to a T, it's just like the women expect you to like basically be their slave. The men still want to live their life, and everybody's disappointed. Middle-class marriage, in fact, was not romantic, for in the middle-class marriage, like everything else, was subject to the middle-class systems of value. Within that value system, middle-class persons choose a marriage partner who would assist them in achieving middle-class goals of status and achievement. A woman, with her parents' approval, chose a husband who showed promise of being a good provider and a steady, reliable social achiever who would be able to give her a material status at least as high as that provided by her own parents. See, that's part of hypergamy that people don't really pay attention to. It's like you have to be better than her dad. That's it's like you just go, oh well, why do the guys not like they pick this guy or they pick that guy? But a lot of it does have to do with the dad, and since the dad's not there anymore, in a lot of cases, that screws it up, and then they get it from the media. A man chose as a wife one who showed promise of being a help in his upward struggle, one able to act as a hostess to his aspirant activities and to provide the domestic decorum and social graces expected of a successful business or professional man. Such a marriage was based from both sides on status factors rather than on personal factors. The fact that a man was a Yale graduate, was trained for a profession, had a position with a good firm, drove an expensive car, could order dinner with assurance in an expensive restaurant, and had already applied for membership in a golf or country club were not reasons for loving him as a person, since they were simply the accessories of his status. Yet middle class persons married for reasons such as these and at the same time convinced themselves and their friends that they were marrying for romantic love based on the fact that they were, in addition to their mutual social acceptability, sexually attracted. For the time, the new marriage could keep up these pretenses, especially as the elements of sex and novelty in the relationship helped conceal the contrast between theory and fact, and that the marriage was basically an external and superficial relationship. But this fact remained, and in time, unconscious frustration and dissatisfaction began to operate. Often these did not reach the conscious level, especially a few generations ago, but today the question is posed by every woman's magazine: is your marriage a success? But unconsciously, long before this, realization had been growing that the marriage relationship was not based on love, which must be a recognition and appreciation of personal qualities, not of status accessories. Without personal feeling based on such personal qualities, the relationship was not really a personal relationship and was not really based on love, even when the partners, with the usual lack of introspection associated with middle class minds, insisted that it was based on love. No, it's based on sex and money. The consequence the consequences of such unconscious recognition of the real lack of love in the bourgeois marital relationship in a society that never stopped reiterating in song, cinema, magazine, and book the absolute necessity of love for human happiness and fulfillment will be examined in a moment. 3 generations ago, the bourgeois wife rarely became aware of her frustrations. She was largely confined to her home, was kept too busy with children and housework to find much time for meditation on her situation or for comparison with other wives or the outside world generally. See, that comparison stuff will really get you, especially social media, where you got billionaires on there and all this other stuff, and then your wife's comparing you to them, you're cooked. Brought up in a male dominated family, she was prepared to accept a similar position in her own life. This means that her outside contracts and her general picture of the world came to her through the screen of her husband's vision of these things. The decrease in the number of children in middle class families and the spread of labor saving devices from vacuum cleaners to frozen food gave the bourgeois wife increasing leisure in the 1920s and 1930s. Enterprising editors like Edwin Bok filled that leisure with new, slick women's magazines like the Ladies' Home Journal, popular novels, and to a lesser extent, the early movies, dramatic matinees, and spreading women's clubs allowed women to build up a vision of a fantasy world of romantic love and carefree, middle class housewives with dazzling homes and well behaved and well scrubbed children. By 1925, the average bourgeois housewife was becoming increasingly frustrated because her own life was not that pictured in the women's magazines. Her increasing leisure gave her time to think about it, and her more frequent contact with other wives encouraged her to raise her voice in criticism of her husband, whose financial inability to provide her with the life she came to regard as her due seemed to her to justify her desire to nag him onward to greater effort in pursuit of money. To him, this became nagging. To her, it was only an occasional reminder of the expectations under which she had entered upon the marriage relationship. While this was going on, the outside world was also changing. Women had become emancipated as a consequence of World War I, with considerable urging onward from the women's magazines. Oh, really? The women's magazines were what were encouraging the women? It wasn't, they just didn't come up with the idea on their own? It wasn't just like, oh, women just woke up one day and they're like, wait a minute, we don't want to have kids or husbands. Oh, no, wait, it was women's magazines. You mean the media? Shorter skirts and shorter hair became symbols of this process, but even more significant was the appearance in the outside world of a great increase in the number of jobs that could be done best or only by women, like prostitution. As a part of this process, there took place considerable changes in bourgeois morality, the ending of chaperonage, greater freedom between the sexes, and the acceptance of divorce as morally possible in bourgeois life, a custom that came in from the stage and cinema. This whole chapter just needs a post-it note. Just this whole chapter is just post-it note. As a part of this whole process, there occurred a dramatic event of great social significance. This was the reversal in longevity expectations of men and women in adult life. A century ago, to be sure, in a largely rural context, a 20-year-old man could expect to live longer than a 20-year-old wife. In fact, such a man might well bury 2 or 3 wives, usually from the mortality associated with childbirth or other female problems. Today, a 20-year-old man has a little expectation of living as long as a 20-year-old woman. To make matters worse, a 20-year-old woman a century ago married a man considerably older than herself, at least in the middle classes, simply because future preference required that a man be established economically before he began to raise a family. Yeah, that's how it used to work. Today, from a series of causes, such as the extension of the female expectation of life faster than the male expectation, the increased practice of birth control, coeducation, which brings the sexes into contact at the same age, weakening of future preference, and the middle class outlook generally, which leads to marriages by couples of about the same age, husbands now generally die before their wives. Recognition of this, the increased independence of women, adaptation to taxes, and other legal nuisances has given rise to joint financial accounts, to property being put in the wife's name, and to greatly increased insurance benefits for wives. Gradually, the wealth of the country became female owned, even if still largely male controlled. Wow, this guy's going in on feminism. But this had subtle results. It made women more independent and more outspoken. Bourgeois men gradually came to live under a regime of persistent nagging to become better providers. To many men, work became a refuge and a relief from domestic revelations of inadequacy of their performance as economic achievers. They're like, why aren't you as rich as Bob? Why aren't you as rich as Sam? Oh, your boss makes more money than you. It's like, I'm going to work every day. And then they're like, no, you got to get more money. I need more of this. I need more of that. This growth of overwork, of constant tension, of frustration, of emotional life, and of leisure began to make more and more men increasingly willing to accept death as the only method of achieving rest. Bro, bro, bruh. Yo, I couldn't even say that. This growth of overwork, of constant tension, of frustration of emotional life, and of leisure began to make more and more men increasingly willing to accept death as the only method of achieving rest. Bourgeois men literally began to kill themselves by unconscious psychic suicide from overwork, neurotic overindulgence in alcohol, smoking, work, and violent leisure, and the middle class slowly increased its proportion of materially endowed widows. One notable change in this whole process was a shift over the past century from the male dominated family to a female dominated family. The locality in which the young couple set up their home had an increasing tendency to be matrilocal rather than patrilocal in increasing numbers of cases where the young couple married before the groom's educational process was finished. They even lived with her family, but very rarely with his family. Increasingly, part of the burden of housework was shifted to the husband, washing dishes, buying groceries, even tending the children. In 1840, a child could cry at night and would invariably be tended by its mother, while the father slept peacefully on, totally unaware of what was going on. Well, yeah, that's because women's ears are literally designed different than men. Women can hear more high pitched sounds because they're literally so that they can hear the baby crying, and men hear more low pitched sounds and they'll wake up to low pitched rumbling and stuff when women won't. Because if in case someone's breaking in or trying to attack you, men wake up when they hear low rumbling sounds, and women wake up when they hear high pitched sounds. And that's how it worked. By 1960, if a child cried at night, the chances were likely as not that the mother would hear nothing while the father took over the necessary activities. If this were questioned by anyone, the mother's retort was pointed. I take care of the baby all day. I don't see why he can't take care of it at night. Closely related to this confusion, or even reversal of the social roles of the sexes, was decreasing sexual differentiation in child rearing practices. As recently as the 1920s, girl babies were reared differently from boys. They were dressed differently, treated differently, permitted to do different things, and admonished about different dangers. By 1960, children, regardless of sex, were all being brought up the same. Indeed, with a short cropped hair and play suits on both, it became impossible to be sure which was which. This led to a decrease in the personality differences of men and women, with males becoming more submissive and females more aggressive. Damn, he is really going in on feminism here. I can't believe this. This tendency was accelerated by new techniques of education, especially in the first 12 years of life. The neurological maturation of girls was faster than of boys, especially in regards to coordination, such as in feeding oneself, talking, dressing oneself, toilet training, learning to read, and general adjustments to school. The shift from home to school in the early grades was adjusted to by girls more easily than by boys, partly because girls were more self assured and gregarious. By the age of 10 or 12, girls were developed physically, neurologically, emotionally, and socially about 2 years in advance of boys. All this tended to make boys less self assured, indecisive, weak, and dependent. The steady increase in the percentage of women teachers in the lower grades worked in the same direction, since women teachers favored girls and praised those attitudes and techniques that were more natural to girls. New methods, such as the whole word method of teaching, reading, or the use of true, false, or multiple choice examinations, were also better adapted to female than to masculine talents. Less and less emphasis was placed on critical judgment, while more and more was placed on intuitive or subjective decisions. In this environment, girls did better and boys felt inferior or decided that school was a place for girls and not for boys. The growing aggressiveness of girls pushed these hesitant boys aside and intensified the problem. As consequences of this, boys had twice as many non readers as girls, several times as many strutters, and many times as many teenage bedwetters. While the outside world was decreasing its differential treatment of children on a sexual basis by treating boys and girls more and more alike, and that treatment was better adapted to girls than to boys. Within the middle class home, the growing emotional frustrations of the mother were leading to an increasing distinction on a sexual basis in her emotional treatment of her children. The earliest feeling of sensual reassurance and comfort any child experiences is against the body of its mother. To a boy baby, this is a heterosexual relationship, while to the girl, it is a relationship with the same sex. In most cases, the little girl avoids any undesirable persistence of this homosexual tendency by shifting her admiration and attention to some available male, usually her father. Thus, by the age of 6 or 8, a daughter has become daddy's girl, awaiting his return from work to communicate the news of the day, getting his slippers and newspaper, and hoping that he will read her a story or share her viewing of a favorite television program before she must go to bed. By the age of 12, in a normal girl, this interest in male creatures has begun to shift to some boy in her class at school. With a boy baby, the transference is later and less gradual. The undesirable aspects of his love for his mother are avoided by the powerful social pressures of the incest taboo, but this merely means that the sexual element in his concern for this opposite sex is suppressed and is undeveloped. Thus, there is a natural, we might say almost biological tendency in our society for the sexual development of the boy to be delayed and for the girl to be free from this retarding influence. Bruh, I did not know that he was a MGTOW. In the American middle class family of today, these influences have been extraordinarily exaggerated. Because the middle class marriage is based on social rather than personal attraction, the emotional relationship of the wife to her husband is insecure, and the more her husband buries himself in his work, hobbies, or outside interests, the more insecure and unsatisfactory it becomes for his wife. Part of the wife's unused emotional energy begins to be expended in her love for her son. At the same time, because of the emotional insecurity in the mother's relationship with her husband, the daughter may come to be regarded as an emotional rival for the husband's affection. The Electra complex. This resentment of the daughter is most likely to occur when there is some other cause of disturbance in the mother's psychology, especially if this cause is associated with her relationship to her own father. For example, as female domination becomes, generation by generation, a more distinctive feature of American family life, the daughter's shift of attention to her father becomes less complete, and by adolescence, she tends to pity him rather than to admire him and may become relatively ambivalent in her feelings towards both her father and mother, sometimes hating the latter for dominating her father and despising his weakness in allowing it. In such a case, the whole development of which we speak is accelerated and intensified in the next generation, and the daughter's relatively ambivalent feelings towards her parents are repeated in her relatively ambivalent feelings towards her husband. Wow. So, yeah, weak dad then makes her pursue a weak husband, but at the same time despise the guy for being weak, even though the schools are basically training guys to be more submissive. by all this, basically, what would you call it? Like ambiguous sexualization of children, like making boys and girls dress the same, act the same, go to co-ed schools. I'm telling you, the co-ed schools are a lot of what's screwing guys up. Because you can't, because how can you compete like in sports and all this other stuff? That's because as soon as you introduce women into the mix, it completely changes the dynamic of what women, then they start trying to impress women instead of like doing their job. This serves to intensify both her emotional smothering and overprotection of her son and her tendency towards emotional rejection of her daughter as a potential danger to the relatively precarious emotional relationship between husband and wife. As a consequence of this situation, the frustrated wife has a tendency to cling to her son by keeping him dependent and immature as long as possible and to seek to hasten the maturing of her daughter in order to edge her out of the family circle as soon as possible. Wow. Wow. The chief consequence of this is increasingly late maturity, the weakness, under sexuality, and dependence of American boys and American men of middle class origins, and the increasingly early maturing aggressiveness, over sexuality, and independence of American middle class girls. The mother's alienation of the daughter, which often reaches an acute condition of mutual hatred, may begin in childhood or even at birth, especially if the baby girl is beautiful, is not nursed by the mother, and is welcomed with excessive joy by the husband. It usually becomes acute when the daughter reaches puberty and may become very acute if the mother, about the same time, is approaching her menopause, which she often mistakenly feels will reduce her attraction as a woman to her husband. During this whole period, the mother's rejection of her daughters appear chiefly in her efforts to force her to grow up rapidly and leads to premature exposure of the daughter to such modern monstrosities as preteen mixed parties, training bras, access to overly sophisticated movies, books, and conversations, and the practice of leaving daughters unchaperoned in the house with boy classmates on the early high school or even junior high school level. Such experiences and the increasingly frequent clashes of temperament between mother and daughter lead a surprisingly large percentage of middle class girls to move from the home before the age of 20. And whether she leaves or not, sexual and emotional maturity comes to the American middle class girl earlier and earlier, not only in comparison with the middle class boy, but even in absolute terms. We are told, for example, that the onset of puberty among American girls, an event which can be dated exactly by the first menstrual period, has been occurring at an earlier age by about 9 months for each passing decade. As a result, this milestone is reached by American girls today up to 3 years earlier than with American girls of the earlier 20th century. Over the same period, the American middle class boy has been moving in the opposite direction, although the physiological element cannot be documented. Indeed, it need not be. More significant is the changing relationship between the arrival of sexual awareness and the emotional readiness to accept sex. There can be no doubt that the American child today needs to be homeschooled in a non-co-ed environment. No, hold on. Especially in a middle-class family, becomes aware of sex much earlier than he did a generation or two ago, and long before he is emotionally ready to face the fact of his own sexuality. You mean before he has a job and owns a house and a car so that he could actually have sex? In the 19th century, three things came fairly close together in the 15 to 17 age bracket. 1. Sexual awareness. 2. Emotional readiness for sex. And 3. The ending of education and the opportunity to seek economic independence from parents. Today's sexual awareness comes very early for all, perhaps around the age of 10. Emotional readiness to face the fact of one's own sexuality comes earlier and earlier for the girl today, but later and later for the boy, chiefly because the middle class mother forces independence and recognition of the fact that she is a woman upon her daughter, but forces dependence and blindness to the fact that he is a man upon her son, and the date for the ending of education and seeking economic independence from parents gets somewhat light later for girls, but immensely later for men, a process that becomes increasingly extravagant. One result of this is that the much greater, sometimes indefinitely postponed delay for a boy of emotional readiness after sexual awareness leaves the boy emotionally desexed for so long that it affects his sexuality and emotional maturity adversely and to an increasingly advanced age. But the opposite is true for a girl because of the shorter and decreasing lag of her emotional readiness after her sexual awareness. Lolita, who is not as rare as the readers of that novel wanted to imagine, becomes increasingly frequent and cannot be satisfied by boys of her own age. Consequently, she seeks for many reasons, including financial resources and greater emotional maturity, her sex companions among older men. I think we should put a post-it note there just because of recent events and people trying to act bro, bro. This is exactly what people have been saying. On the other hand, the position of the middle class boy becomes even more complex and pitiful since he must not only face the fluctuating chronology of these developments to a greater degree, but must free himself from his emotional dependence on his mother with little help from anyone. If his father tries to help, and he is the only one who is likely to try to do so, and insists that his son become a responsible and independent human being, the mother fights like a tigress to defend her son's continued immaturity and dependence, accusing the husband of cruelty, of hatred for his son, and of jealousy of his son's feelings for the mother. She does not hesitate to use the weapon that she has. There are many and powerful, including a reluctant and ambiguous revelation to the son that his father hates him. Any effort by the father to argue that true love must seek to help the son advance in maturity and independence, and that insistence that he avoid or postpone these advances might well be regarded as hatred rather than love, are usually backed with or blocked with ease. At this stage in the family history, emotional frustrations and confusions are generally at so high a level that it is fairly easy for mother and son to agree that black is white. Momism is usually triumphant for a more or less extended period, while normal adolescent rebellion becomes a wholesale rejection of the father, and only much later a delayed effort at achieving emotional detachment from the mother. The point of all this is that normal adolescent rebellion has become, in America today, a radical and wholesale rejection of parental values, including middle class values, because of the protracted emotional warfare which now goes on in the middle class home with teenage children. The chief damage in the situation lies in the pervasive destruction of the adolescent middle class boy and his alienation from the achieving aspects of middle class culture. The middle class girl, chiefly because she still tries to please her father, may continue to be a considerable success as an achiever, especially in academic life, where her earlier successes make continuance of the process fairly easy. But the middle class boy who rejects the achieving aspects of middle class life often does so in an academic matters that seem to him to be an alien and feminine world from the beginning. His rejection of this world and his unconscious yearning for academic failure arise from a series of emotional influences. 1. A desire to strike back at his father. 2. A desire to free himself from dependence on his mother and thus to escape from the feminine atmosphere of much of academic life. And 3. A desire to escape from the endless academic road going to age 23 or later, which modern technical and social complexities require for access to positions leading to high middle class success. The lengthening of the interval of time between sexual awareness and the ending of education from about 2 years in the 1880s to at least 10 or 12 years in the 1960s has set up such tensions and strains in the bourgeois American family that they threaten to destroy the family and are already in the process of destroying much of the middle class outlook that was once so distinctive of the American way of life. From this has emerged an almost total breakdown of communications between teenagers and their parents' generation. Generally, the adolescents do not tell their parents their most acute problems. They do not appeal to their parents or adults, but to each other for help in facing such problems, except where emotionally starved girls appeal to men teachers. And when any effort is made to talk across the gap between the generations, words may pass, but communication does not. Behind this protective barrier, a new teenage culture has grown up. Its chief characteristic is rejection of parental values and of middle class culture. In many ways, this new culture is like that of African tribes. Its taste in music and the dance, its emphasis on sex play, its increasingly scanty clothing, its emphasis on group solidarity, the high value it puts on interpersonal relations, especially talking and social drinking, its almost total rejection of future preference, and its constant efforts to free itself from the tyranny of time. Teenage solidarity and sociality, and especially the solidarity of their groups and subgroups, are amazingly African in attitudes as they gather nightly, or at least on the weekends, to drink cokes, talk, intermint, interminably in the midst of throbbing music, preferably in semi-darkness, with couples drifting off for sex play in the corners as a kind of social diversion and a complete emancipation from time. Usually they have their own language with vocabulary and constructions so strange that parents find them almost incomprehensible. 6. 7. This Africanization of American society is gradually spreading with the passing years to higher age levels in our culture and is having profound and damaging effects on the transfer of middle class values to the rising generations. A myriad of symbolic acts over the last 20 years have served to demonstrate the solidarity of teen culture and its rejection of middle class values. Many of these involve dress and dating customs, both major issues in the adolescent parental Cold War. All right, I'm gonna stop reading there. I'm not even gonna go like he just went like full MGTOW like in this chapter. Where does that start? Like page like 1256, like he just starts going in. Oh, here, no. 1255. That's when he starts going in on the MGTOW stuff. Ridiculous. I mean, it's so accurate too, where it's like the mother hates the daughter, so then she forces the daughter out of the house to become a sleut at like age 14, right? And then she tries to like make the son into like a son husband, so he can't leave the house. She like takes away all the training and ability that he would need to become like an economically viable person, trapping you in the house, and then you basically end up having to like spend your time hanging out in the woods and stuff like that just to get away from your parents' crazy psychological problems that they have because of this whole idea of the economic marriage, where the only reason why the wife is with the husband is because he can provide the social benefits and amenities that she feels like she deserves for being a woman. I'm a woman. I deserve all this stuff that I see in the women's magazines that are literally produced by the CIA. And if you can't provide all these things, just like Joe and Bob and Sam and Tim are for their wives, then I'm out of here and you're going to be screwed, right? Divorce is on the rise. It's the divorce and the material and the woman causing the man to buy all the stuff are completely connected together, because it goes back to that middle class psychological fear of being broke, right? So, and then women are playing on that. They're like, oh, you want to get a divorce? You don't want to get a divorce because then you'll be broke living in your car, right? And so the man's like, oh, I'll do whatever you say. Oh, new house, new kitchen, new this, new that. Oh, how much more new stuff do, right? Otherwise, you get like Timothy Blades, right? Where, oh, you don't want to do it? Oh, well, I'll just take the car, take the kids, take the house, and now you have nothing, right? It seems to line up perfectly like with what he's saying. So I guess Carol Quigley is now honorary MGTOW. All right, gonna get out of here with that. Thanks for watching the video if you did. If you didn't, you won't hear this part anyway. So have a good day and peace.